Well, welcome to Allegiance to the King. This is Christian Virtual Fellowship, the online church ministry for Allegiance to the King. You can find us at a2kchurch.org or at allegiancetotheking.org and check us out. If you like what you're hearing in our videos, you're seeing in our videos, we really would invite you to join us for church. If you're an isolated biblical Unitarian out there that there's lots of resources online to study, to videos to watch, to read, things like that, but you don't have a church home, then that's what Christian Virtual Fellowship is all about. Well, tonight I'm going to start a series on Isaiah, and this will take a little while to go through. Not tonight, but and I'm not sure how long it's going to be over the course of the coming months, but this is going to be an introduction and overview for that. And I've titled it Isaiah, the First Gospel. Isaiah is often called the fifth gospel, and the reason is because it contains the gospel message. But I decided I'm going to call it the first gospel because it was written first. It was written before, obviously, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And so we're going to go through that. Let me give you a quick content slide here about tonight. We're going to talk about the goal for this series. We'll get a little bit into historical background behind Isaiah. We'll talk about the message of Isaiah, the structure of Isaiah, which is really critical to understanding how you get to the understanding of the message of Isaiah, and the value of Isaiah as a whole and not as snippets of verses. I think for a lot of us, Isaiah is this big book in the Old Testament that has some really great quotes, and some of which are used more than once in the New Testament. And so, yeah, that's the sort of the typical interaction with Isaiah is these little quotes from Isaiah. But I wanted us to get to the point where we can really appreciate Isaiah in its entirety. And so as we go through this, the main goal is that we get the big picture of Isaiah, and we learn to understand how to interact with Isaiah, how to appreciate how it's written and why things are coming together the way that they are. So let's take a quick look at the historical background. First, we'll look at Isaiah himself and his life. He lived from the mid 8th century BC to the early 7th century BC. He obviously was a prophet. He was commissioned by God rather dramatically in chapter 6. And his ministry itself runs from 740 to somewhere around 680 BC. It's a little tricky to exactly date when his ministry came to an end. The Bible itself doesn't really tell us. There are some extra biblical documents that have a story of his death. It may be alluded to in the Bible, maybe. Depending upon those kind of things, it's somewhere in the 680s. Certainly, it would seem that he died after Hezekiah's reign, but 680, and there's reasons for 680. I'm not going to get into that tonight. His ministry took place during the reigns of Uzziah. These are the kings of Judah: Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And with Uzziah, it appears that his commission in chapter 6 begins the year that Uzziah dies. So at some point in that time, and because it says that he prophesied during the reigns of these 4 kings, that probably he was right in that year for a little bit while Uzziah was still alive, but that would make it about 740. And he had some contemporaries, other prophets that were around the same time, Micah and Hosea especially, Amos as well, just in that same time range a little bit before, and then possibly Joel. Joel's a little bit harder for scholars to date, but it's possible that he's from that same time range. So he's generally referred to as an 8th century pre-exilic prophet. So in other words, in the 8th century, the 700s BC, and that he's prophesying before the exile, before the Jews are carted off to Babylon. So the group of prophets around that time. Some historical events, just to kind of set a sort of a picture, a map, a timeline. 733, 732 timeframe. Syria and Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, rebelled against Assyria. They tried to get Judah involved in that. Judah, under Ahaz, appeals to Assyria for. They say, he says no, and then they're going to attack him, and he appeals to Syria. Syria comes in, and Assyria comes in and destroys Syria, Damascus, and there's a coup in the northern kingdom of Israel, and they're not destroyed at that time, but Syria is. Then in 722 to 21, Israel rebels against Assyria, and Assyria destroys Israel at that time. So this is the actual point at which the northern kingdom comes to an end. Then in 701, Judah assisted Babylon in rebelling against Assyria, and Assyria defeats Babylon and nearly destroys Judah, but God stops Assyria from doing that at Jerusalem. Sennacherib, the king, had taken over all the rest of Judah, had come in with his armies and conquered all around, and they basically were going to sack Jerusalem, but God steps in this very dramatic way that we'll get into at a certain point in the series. In 612 to 605, so nearly 100 years later, is finally when Babylon defeats Assyria. Then in 597, Judah rebels for the first time against Babylon. Babylon defeats Judah and deports the king Jehoiachin off, and a number of officials and people off to Babylon. It's the first carrying off to Babylon. And then in 588 to 586, Judah rebels again against Babylon. This time, Nebuchadnezzar comes and he destroys Jerusalem and the temple, and carts a whole lot of people off. There is another rebellion after this that's just a governor of Judah at that point, and some more carrying off, and there's really not a lot of people left in the land after that. In 539, Persia defeats Babylon. This is when Cyrus comes in and defeats Babylon, takes over the city. And then in 538, very shortly after he defeats it, Cyrus allows the Jews to return to their homeland. And I should say, I'm giving you these dates. There's always a little bit of fudge in dates. It's difficult sometimes to date things, so I'm just giving you as approximate as much of a consensus as there might be. And then in 516, 515, the rebuilding of the temple is completed. So a number of years later, finally, there was a gap of about a decade and a half between when it got started and then nothing was happening, and then it gets completed. So that gives you kind of a sort of a timeline of things going on that are happening both in Isaiah's lifetime, but then also things that are happening associated with the prophecies in the book of Isaiah. Okay, so let's talk about the message of Isaiah. This is obviously the most important aspect of the book of Isaiah, is its message. First, and I'm going to give you 4 bullets that are together the overarching message of the book of Isaiah. First is God is judging his people, and they are guilty of gross violation of the covenant, and that God is also going to judge the nations. Yet, God will save a repentant and obedient remnant of God's people, which will include a repentant and obedient remnant from the nations. So Zion, the city of God, the true people of Israel, will be saved and enter God's glorious kingdom. And the wicked, on the other hand, will be destroyed. So these four things together, this is the overarching message of the book of Isaiah. And it's told in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different forms or ways in which that message is expressed in the book of Isaiah. There are court trials, there are parables, there are historical narratives, there are prophecies and oracles, songs, there are summaries and refrains, and there is form and structure that is also expressing this message. And a common one in the book of Isaiah is the structure of palistrophe. And I'm going to explain what that is. So a palistrophe is a form. This was an ancient method of writing something in a semi-poetic way, and not like when we think of poetry, but a lot of the Old Testament is actually written in forms like this, as some of the New Testament is as well, and not necessarily palistrophes, but different kinds of things like this. And so this is the way a palistrophe works. You have the first part is we'll call theme A. Then you have the next part, theme B. Then you have, say, theme C, and this could be more. It could be A, B, C, D, E, F, that kind of thing. There needs to be at least about this much. So there's theme A, theme B. Theme C is the focal point in this case, in this particular example of a palistrophe. And then you go back to theme B again. Sometimes it's in contrast of the first appearance of theme B, or it could just be a repetition of theme B. And then finally you go back again to theme A. Again, it might be a contrast, but we're still talking about the same kind of subject matter as originally. And what this is doing is it's focusing us on theme C. That the author is utilizing each of these components as a way of pointing to the main point, which is theme C. It's not that these other things aren't important to the whole of the message, but of the palistrophe, but they're all contributing to get you to see theme C as the main thrust. So I want to give you an example, just a made-up example of a simple palistrophe to get to further understand this, because this is a really important concept in the book of Isaiah. We're going to see this particular form a lot. So John reluctantly left home and walked to the store. There's A. He became soaked because of the rain. There's B. But John faithfully bought the groceries his wife wanted. There's our main point. Now we're going to go back to B. The ground was muddy on his way back, and his shoes became caked. So you can see there's this thing about the weather, and it's a fact. It's mirroring theme B. And then we go back to A. He was glad to return home. So we're still on A, but now we're contrasting, right? So John was reluctant to leave home, but now he's glad to come home, right? So this is a simple example of a palistrophe. Typically in Isaiah, especially, they can be very, very long in terms of the palistrophes. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. Because you can have theme A could be more than one chapter, for instance, and that kind of thing. Just looking at a few of the themes, the major themes of the book of Isaiah, you get king and kingdom, especially in the first part of the book. And you get Yahweh as the Lord of history, and that he's running things. And you get a judgment/destruction for the wicked and the faithless. You get atonement and deliverance as a theme for the obedient remnant. You get this theme of anointed servants, or the promise of a Messiah, an anointed one who's going to bring that deliverance. You get several things concerning the nations. You get the nations are a tool that God will use with regard to his people. You see in a number of major sections of Isaiah condemnation of the nations. And then you also see that God is, as a theme, God is going to save a remnant of the nations and incorporate them into the people of God. Then you get a theme of Yahweh versus false gods and idols. You get a major theme of the new creation, and you get this introduction of the new covenant. That the first time, it's not called the new covenant in Isaiah, and we'll a little bit later we'll get into that, but it is the introduction of the new covenant. So looking at the structure of Isaiah, we see a number. When you read various scholars on Isaiah and its structure, there's going to be differences from one author to another, but there's some major things. First of all, it's a challenge. Right? The structure of Isaiah is a big challenge, and there's been a lot of back and forth and different ideas and stuff like that about how are you supposed to think about how this book is supposed to come together. Is it even supposed to be something that has an overarching theme, a meta narrative? Is that the case or not? But there's a lot of challenge to it. One of the big ones is it one book, or is it two books, or even three books, or even more fragmented than that? Since the 19th century, the late 19th century anyway, the most common thinking among scholars has been that it's at least two books and potentially three. We'll get into that a little further in a bit. But I think I should say this, a common way of thinking about Isaiah is that it's an anthology of Isaiah's writings, or Isaiah's writings and maybe some other writings, and they're sort of patchworked together into this single book, this single scroll, but they don't necessarily have to do with each other. So if you think about an anthology and you've got this piece over here is talking about this thing, and then you move on to something else and it's talking about something else, and they're not necessarily related, they're just collected. And that's certainly a view of a lot of scholars, is that concept of anthology. But I think, but some scholars have a different view of this, and I think that a better way to think about Isaiah, and this has been a growing theme since probably the 1980s amongst commentators, to think about the book of Isaiah as a whole, even if it did have multiple authors, but to think about it as it has come to us as this single book, and think in terms of what is it trying to say as a whole. And a better way, I think, of thinking about it is as a mosaic. If you think about what a mosaic is, you take little pieces, let's say of like colorful stones or something like that, or sometimes you'll see online a digital image that you're looking at, like, say, somebody's face, for instance, but you can, as you zoom in on it, you realize the face is constructed with all of these tiny little pictures of maybe that person's face in different shades and lighting and all that kind of stuff. And it's been brought together as this mosaic to create an overall picture with all these little pieces. And I think that the book of Isaiah is much better described as a mosaic. That, yes, there's all these different pieces, they're all brought together in these ways that are purposeful to create an overarching picture. There's also the concept of the message is repeated throughout the book. That it's not like you get this part of the message in the first part of the book, and the second part of the message in the second part of the book, and a third part of the message and in the third part of the book. It doesn't really work that way. It's repeating the message over and over again throughout the book in these different sections that we'll get into the sections here in a minute. And the idea is that each section is contributing its own purpose or sound to that message. So if you think about a symphony coming together, they're all playing these different parts, but it comes into a whole. And that's the idea, that each repetition of the message is done in a little different way, or maybe even a lot different way. And it's still giving you that same message, that 4-bullet message that we talked about earlier. And then there's the structural divisions themselves, as that, how it's divided up. And this is different scholars are going to argue about, is it divided? Is there a structural division here, or is it a little bit later? That kind of thing. For the most part, scholars are going to divide the book up into sections that seem fairly similar from scholar to scholar, for the most part, with some division, with some differences in the divisions. But what I'm going to do, I've just laid my cards on the table, that I have found that Paul Wegner's divisions seem to make the most sense out of the structure, and he's got a good argument for why he's dividing it up the way that he's dividing it. I'm going to give you that in a minute. And so I'm going to use his structure. It doesn't mean that he's necessarily 100% right, but I think it's a pretty good approach. And I think it's very helpful to seeing this overarching message of the book of Isaiah. So let's look at those. So there's these message repetitions, and there's 6 of them in the way that Wegner divides it up that we're going to use. The first is chapter 1. And I've labeled this a message of judgment for the disobedient. And then chapters 2 through 12 are the second section, where we get this message is being repeated again. This section division actually has 2 components to it, and when we get into it, we'll talk about that. But I'm calling this the second message of judgment for the disobedient. The third section, I've labeled Oracles of Judgment and Restoration, chapters 13 through 39, because this section is actually a palistrophe, and the Oracles of Judgment and Restoration are the focal piece of that palistrophe. Then chapters 40 through 48, I've labeled this Yahweh is the only true God who can deliver us. This is, again, another palistrophe, and the central section is a section on the fact that Yahweh is the only true God who can deliver us. Then the next section is chapters 49 through 57. I've labeled this one a message of salvation for the faithful. And then chapter 58 through 66, I'm just titling a second message of salvation for the faithful. Now, each of these is going to have those 4 components that we talked about. It's going to talk about the judgment. It's going to talk about the remnant or the deliverance. It's going to talk about the city of Zion, Jerusalem. The people of God are going to be saved out of this whole problem. They're going to be atoned for, that kind of thing, and that the wicked will be destroyed. And so they're all doing that in different ways, bringing it in different forms and things like that. So let's look at how the keys to these 6 divisions. So the first 3 are essentially introductions, where there is an introduction at the beginning of the section that reads like this. Well, I've got all 3 of them here, so we'll see them. So in chapter 1, verse 1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which he saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So in this case, we see this introduction. And so that's introducing. Well, then the next introduction like this occurs at the beginning of chapter 2. The word which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. The third one doesn't come along until chapter 13. the pronouncement concerning Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw. So the idea is the first three repetitions, they have these introductions of Isaiah seeing a vision, a pronouncement, a word from the Lord, that sort of thing. And then the last three, they have refrains at the end of them, so that they're beginning with chapter 40, that you have at the end of the section, you have an indicator that the section has ended. The first of which is at Isaiah 48:22 with the phrase, "There is no peace for the wicked, says the Lord." So it's like a refrain. Because in Isaiah 57:21, it gets repeated at the end of this next section. "There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked." And then finally, you get an expanded version of that refrain in Isaiah 66:24 at the very end, the last verse, where it says, "Then they will go out and look," the remnant will go out and look at the corpses of the people who have rebelled against me, for their worm will not die, and their fire will not be extinguished, and they will be an abhorrence to all mankind. In other words, there's no peace for the wicked. And so these three tell you the end of each section. And as we delve in the series through each of these sections, we'll look at the section itself and how it forms up in its individual form, like we talked about with 13 through 39. How do you see the palistrophe? Where are the different changes in the palistrophe? That kind of thing. And we'll but we're not going to get into that tonight. We'll get into it as we get into the series. I want to talk about authorship for a minute. This is the most debated part of the book of Isaiah. Certainly the most controversial part of Isaiah, at least in modern times. It is. It wasn't until more modern times. But I want to take just a few minutes to talk about this. It doesn't necessarily affect how we deal with the book itself and what it's doing, but I think it's important to talk about it, and certainly to understand the issues around authorship. And then I'll give you my thoughts about what I think the actual who the author is. All right, so first of all, I want to give you basically our four options of who wrote this thing. So the first is that Isaiah wrote it and that he compiled it. So there's who wrote the material, and then there's who put it together into this final form, this mosaic. And those are really two different questions. So one option is that Isaiah wrote it and he put the mosaic together. The second is Isaiah wrote the material and then somebody else put the mosaic together. So it could be, for instance, some followers of his afterwards, some editors later, putting his writings together in this particular form. So that's an option. Third one is Isaiah wrote parts and then others wrote other parts or made edits. So maybe Isaiah wrote the first part, but somebody else wrote the second part or even a third part, or maybe multiple parts are by other people, but at least part of this Isaiah actually wrote. And then finally, somebody else wrote it. There's not a prophet, Isaiah, that wrote this book. This was maybe stories about Isaiah that were passed down, but somebody later on wrote this whole thing. So that's another option, a possibility. The typical divisions are either no division, so it's one book, chapter 1 through chapter 66. A very common way of dividing the book among scholars is two books, the first book being chapters 1 through 39, and the second book being chapters 40 through 66. And then a third way of dividing it up, which is 1 through 39, and then 40 through 55, and then 56 through 66. And some scholars are going to divide it up even more than this, but these are the most common ways. So before we get into looking at, first of all, well, why do the people who think it's multiple authors, multiple divisions, different books, What are some of their reasonings for that? And then get into, looking at it from a holistic, unified approach of, no, this was Isaiah's work. I want to look at some considerations before we get into that stuff that I think are really, really important, not just for here in Isaiah, and not even just for the Bible. This is important in a lot of different fields. And so I want to kind of set these up first. So first of all, there's no way of knowing for sure who wrote the book of Isaiah. It's not like we have video of Isaiah actually writing this book, or that there's anybody alive today that can say, yeah, I was there, Isaiah wrote that book, right? And so without God showing up and telling you that, right? So there's not really a definitive way of doing that. And that's really true of most historical questions. Especially if you go back far enough in time, it's definitely true of all historical questions of how can you know that you know, as opposed to how can you be pretty sure, right? Those are two different kinds of things. And with historical questions like Isaiah, the authorship of Isaiah, you can have some confidence, you can feel like you've got some good arguments and some good conclusions. But the one thing you can't ever have is absolute surety that you definitively have the answer. Second consideration is the idea of data versus interpretation. And this is really important because especially if you're a layperson, you're not a scholar, you're not a technical expert on a subject, that sort of thing, it can be easy to mistake data versus the interpretation of data. So, for example, in a crime scene, data might include a broken window, a bloody knife, the whereabouts of a potential suspect, and those kinds of things. But the conclusion that a certain person is the culprit is an interpretation of that data. That's not data. We're going to arrest so-and-so because he did it. You don't really know that. You just have these different pieces of data, and they've caused you to conclude that, but that's your interpretation. That's not data. Isaiah 1 through 66 is, for the most part, the only data that we have. What we have in the book itself is for the most part, the only data. There's no data for 2 or 3 separate books, since, first and foremost, Isaiah has always appeared as one book in ancient manuscripts. Now, there is data, such as a certain word is used more often in one part of the book than in another, or that one section has a different style than another section, or, for instance, a man named Cyrus is mentioned in chapter 44 who lived long after Isaiah lived. Those are all data points. That's true. But the conclusion, for example, that these things mean that later parts of the book were written after Isaiah's lifetime, that's not data. That's an interpretation. And then finally, if you're not familiar with the idea of critical theory and you're interested in this kind of question of authorship, it's a pretty good idea to gain a little understanding of critical theory, which I'm not going to do tonight. But I am going to say one thing about critical. I'll explain a little bit. Critical theory is basically an approach to things like the book of Isaiah, in which you're trying to break it down, and it's the idea that you're going to approach it. I like to put it this way. I think of it this way. And when I was in graduate school, when I was being taught critical theory, I thought about it this way, that it's sort of a way of being hostile to the text, that you're trying to break it down and discover things about it. And I use that word hostile, but it doesn't have to be hostile. It basically, you're just trying to take this thing apart and discover things about it. But the problem sometimes with critical theory, and critical theory is not always bad. It's certainly contributed a lot to modern understanding of things. But sometimes critical theory can conclude too much from too little. And that's where a kind of danger comes in. So looking at the second major reason is the literary style, the themes, the vocabulary. For example, there are a number of words that are more heavily used in the later part of the book than they are in the first part of the book, and with a few words only being used in the later part of the book. Or, for example, there are some differences in the structure of sentences in the later chapters and things like that. Then the third is theological concepts. For example, the earlier chapters are focused on the concept of messianic king, and the later chapters are focused on a messianic servant. And so these major differences. And then finally is a concept called presupposed contexts. And even among scholars that believe that you can have genuine predictive prophecy, the argument of a presupposed context, which I'll get into in a second, is strong evidence to them of a different author. So what a presupposed context is, when you have say in the later chapters, when the return from exile is being prophesied as in the future, that it is presupposing that the earlier prophecy of being carried off has already taken place. And so that concept is a strong motivator among some scholars that this is an indication that the writer's context is in a period that's later than the life of Isaiah. So these are the major ways. There's others that are that I'm not going to go into, but these are the major ones. And certainly there are obviously scholars who don't believe in predictive prophecy. And so if you've got somebody writing about an event that happened long after their lifetime, then they're just going to say, well, that's clearly not Isaiah, that's somebody else. And that's been a popular view amongst scholars since the 19th century, since a lot of philosophical naturalism and stuff like that has come into various disciplines, including things like the study of Isaiah. So all of those sort of come together in different strengths and weaknesses for different biblical scholars to conclude there's 2 or 3 books and multiple authors. So now let me give you the reasons typically for why it's that Isaiah is the author. It's one book and Isaiah is the author. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it was put together by Isaiah. That's a little bit different question I'm not going to get into. That's a little harder to get to. There are definitely pieces of Isaiah that would appear to be like an editor putting this thing together later from the genuine writings of Isaiah, but that's for different time. But as the author, here's some things that argue for why this whole thing together, Isaiah is the author. Early Jewish and Christian authors all basically say that he was the author. It's not until the 12th century AD that the concept of a second author is even possibly introduced. There's some evidence that a rabbi introduced this concept, but it really doesn't come into any kind of widespread concept until the 19th century on. And so nobody thought this originally. Also, we talked a little bit about the presupposition of fulfilled prophecy, but here's the thing. Just as God predicts the future, there's no reason why God, through his prophets, cannot presuppose a fulfilled prophecy when he's prophesying about a later prophecy. So it doesn't really, I personally don't believe it's a very strong argument, because again, if God is the author, well, then yeah, he can just presuppose this thing when he's giving a new prophecy. Stylistic and vocabulary reasons are weak at best, and that's just all there is to it. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about. And the reason why, and there's been a lot of good scholarship in more recent times, because this used to be a big deal, and it still is a big deal, but there's a lot of pushback on this these days. And part of that comes from the fact that if you're talking about some documents over a longer period of time, well, authors over the span of their lifetime, they can change. Shakespeare, for instance, his writings after the death of his son are pretty different than the writings before the death of his son. And so you get these differences over a lifetime. Certainly, you can get stylistic changes, vocabulary changes that an author himself or herself is using it differently in different parts. You can also have different reasons why an author, the same author, is going to use a different style for one purpose than he or she is for another purpose. So you don't have access to that in terms of the book of Isaiah. Is it reflecting the idea that there's different authors, that there's different vocabulary, different styles? Or is it just that Isaiah either in later writings used different vocabulary and different style, or that Isaiah for this part of the book decided to do something different in terms of style and vocabulary and those sorts of things? And you can't know that. So that's why I say I think it's probably the weakest part of the argument. Similarities to contemporary prophets. There, especially with Micah, there's a number of passages that are very similar between Micah and Isaiah, and this is something that people that do think Isaiah wrote the book are thinking in terms of, well, we don't challenge the fact that Micah is from that period, so here's some similarities with Isaiah, so it must be from that period. And then manuscript evidence is pretty strong, actually. For example, from the Qumran scrolls, the Isaiah scroll is that it's a whole scroll, contains all of Isaiah, and it has no chapter break. It has no break between chapter 39, the end of chapter 39, and the first verse of chapter 40. It's just running straight through. In its column, it's just there it is. And so it's as if the people who were copying that scroll did not envision a break between 39 and 40. There is a part of the scroll where there are some line breaks, and there's a theory about that it's the halfway point through the book. But between 39 and 40, which is the most common division that scholars are going to say means 39 before is one author, 40 and later is a different author, and yet this ancient scroll just has it as one book, and it's consistent through there. Another is prophet differentiation, that if you look at the biblical evidence of the different prophets, you can see that there was an effort made to differentiate the prophets, that even small prophets of the Old Testament, the book is attributed to that prophet rather than, well, this is just some minor thing. Even say Malachi, for instance, or Obadiah, where they're on their own, right? They weren't subsumed into, even if they have common themes with something else, they weren't subsumed with another more major author. And you would look at, well, if you've got 40 through 66 is a major document. If that was written by some other prophet, then why wasn't it designated to that prophet? And so this is one of the things that convinces some scholars that it's a single author. Here's a particularly powerful one. I want to actually read you an excerpt from one of Alec Motyer's commentaries on Isaiah. And here this is geography, and here he's actually quoting another Isaiah author, a commentator, that believes that they're different authors, but he's having a problem with the later chapters with the geography evidence from the language and terms and pictures and stuff like that are being used. And so Motyer is quoting him because this other author, who again thinks that it's a different author, he thinks he has to be from the area of Israel. He can't be from Babylon. And this is what the quote says. When he wants to portray an idolater, he shows him taking his hatchet and going into the forest to fell a tree. This would apparently rule out Egypt or Chaldea being Babylon, for in neither are there trees fit for carving. The oils to be had from the trees mentioned are those of West Asia. The landscapes or the climates of West Asia provide him with with most of his metaphors: mountain, forest, sea, snow, land made fertile by rain and not by the overflow of rivers or by irrigation and drought. Frequent mention of Lebanon and the sea and the islands. So in the later chapters, you get the impression that this author is writing from an Israel context, not a Babylon context, not an exile context. So that's another one that is good evidence for a single author. And then prophetic relevance. This is where one of the arguments put forth regarding predictive prophecy is that it needs to be relevant to the current generation. And there's certainly prophecies in the first part of the book that would be directly relevant to the current generation, such as Ahaz and Hezekiah, for instance. Or else, if it's not directly relevant to the current generation, if it's predicting something that's going to happen later, such as the return from the exile through Cyrus, then it really isn't meaningful. How can it be meaningful to the people it was written to at the time if it's about something that's never going to affect them? But that concept belies a misunderstanding about communal cultures and ancient people and how God is interacting with them in the Bible. Because he's not interacting with the individuals of that time period, of that current generation. He's speaking to a nation that is going to exist across time. And so his prophecies are to the nation as a whole, not to individuals necessarily, to individuals living at that particular time. In fact, predictive prophecy that is supposed to come to pass at the current time, it has a function for that current generation, but it also has a function for the rest of the nation, because you see throughout the Bible the things that are happening, the miracles and fulfilled prophecy and things like that are happening earlier in the book of the Bible are continually used by the prophets to bring people back and remind them about God's faithfulness and those sorts of things. So God is speaking to the nation as a whole. And I think a good example of this concept of talking in terms of nations, even if you're naming an individual, would be the quote, "Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated," that comes from Malachi. It's not talking about the person Jacob or the person Esau. And it's not simply talking about the people at that time. He's talking about over the course of history of the nation of Jacob or Israel and the nation of Esau or Edom. And finally, and I think this is the best evidence for Isaiah as the author, is the New Testament evidence. And I'm going to give you a few quotes here, but there are quite a few quotes in the New Testament. Acts 28:25 says, "And when they disagreed with one another, they began leaving after Paul, they began leaving after Paul said one parting statement: 'The Holy Spirit rightly spoke through Isaiah the prophet to your fathers. And then he's going to quote Isaiah 6, 9 through 10. So here in Isaiah 6, in an early part of the book, Paul is saying that it is the Holy Spirit that is speaking through Isaiah the prophet. And then Matthew chapter 3, verse 3, for this is the one referred to by Isaiah the prophet when he said, the voice of one calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And this comes from Isaiah 43, the latter part of the book that is, purportedly a separate author, separate book. And yet here is Matthew attributing that quote to Isaiah the prophet when he said. And then I think, and then another one in Matthew 8:17 that I think is good. This happened so that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet would be fulfilled. He himself took our illnesses and carried away our diseases. This comes from Isaiah 53. And another, Matthew 15, 7 through 8, you hypocrites, rightly did Isaiah prophesy about you by saying, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me, going back again to the first part of the book in Isaiah 29. But then in John 12, I think you have very powerful evidence for a single author, Isaiah, throughout the entirety of the book. John chapter 12, verses 38 through 41 says, this happened so that the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke, would be fulfilled. So Isaiah the prophet spoke these words, Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason, they could not believe. For Isaiah said again, second quote, he has blinded their eyes and he hardened their heart so that they will not see with their eyes and understand with their heart and be converted. And so I will not heal them. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke about him. The first quote is from Isaiah 53. The second quote is from Isaiah 6:10. So here in the same context, you have the two different parts of Isaiah being talked about and attributed by John to the single prophet Isaiah, that this is what he saw, this is what he spoke. So I think this, for me, I think that the whole of the book of Isaiah is one book structurally, and it through its message, it has this overarching message throughout the entire book, and that it, for various reasons, especially these, the New Testament authors attributing all parts of the book of Isaiah to the prophet Isaiah, and that this is from him, that I'm going to take it as a single book, a single author. Okay, last part that I want to talk about tonight is Isaiah in the New Testament. So Isaiah is the second most quoted book of the Old Testament, about 55 times. Only Psalms is quoted more than that. There are more than 100 allusions. A number of scholars have done studies on this, and typically they find 100 or more allusions in the New Testament to the book of Isaiah, as many as 170 of them. There are 19 quotes and numerous allusions to Isaiah in Romans alone. This the letter to the Romans being about the gospel, that there's a lot of quotes. It's nearly a third of all the quotes of Isaiah in the New Testament are in Romans about the gospel. And so there's a whole lot of Isaiah associated with the gospel. In terms of Jesus and Isaiah, we see Jesus using parables to teach. We see that's coming from Isaiah. He rebukes for giving lip service to God, again, coming from Isaiah. He uses Isaiah to support his cleansing of the temple. The parable of the vineyard that he talks about is, it's like he's taking that out of the song of or sort of leaping from that to the song of the vineyard in Isaiah, which is also a parable. The purpose of his ministry is, he talks about this famous quote from Isaiah 61, 1 and 2 that he gives. He talks about that the work he was doing in terms of quoting Isaiah, and he predicts his death from the book of Isaiah, and that that the people's king is coming to them, is coming straight out of Isaiah that Jesus is talking about. So we see Jesus is interacting with Isaiah a lot and utilizing Isaiah a lot in terms of his own ministry and what he's doing and those sorts of things. We also see that the gospel unfolds as Isaiah said it would. So for instance, we see in John 12, 37 through 41, but though he had performed so many signs in their sight, they still were not believing in him. This happened so that the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke, would be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason, they could not believe. For Isaiah said again, he was blind. He has blinded their eyes, and he has hardened their heart, so they will not see, and their eyes and with their eyes, and understand with their ears, and be converted. And so I will not heal them. These things Isaiah said because he saw his glory and he spoke about him. But then we see in Isaiah 53 where Isaiah says that. Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And then in Isaiah 6:10, make the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes blind, so that they will not see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. So we see it in this example. The gospel is actually unfolding as the message of Isaiah is saying it would. Isaiah announces the new covenant. He doesn't call it the new covenant. That comes in Jeremiah. It's the only place in the Old Testament that it's called the new covenant. It's called the new covenant a number of times in the New Testament, but only once in the Old Testament. It's called by several other names in the Old Testament, and one of them is here in Isaiah 55, 1 through 5. You there, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good, and delight yourself in abundance. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen that you may live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, according to the faithful mercies shown to David, which is talking about his covenant. Behold, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. Behold, you will call a nation you do not know, and a nation which does not know you will run to you, because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. And then again, we see in Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord anointed me to bring good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim release to the captives and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the cloak of praise instead of a disheartened spirit. So they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Then they will rebuild the ancient ruins. They will raise up the former devastations, and they will repair the ruined cities, the desolations of many generations. Strangers will stand and pasture your flocks, and foreigners will be your farmers and your vine dressers. But you will be called the priests of the Lord. You will be spoken of as ministers of our God. You will eat the wealth of nations, and you will boast in their cities. Instead of your shame, you will have a double portion, and instead of humiliation, they will shout for joy over their portion. Therefore, they will possess a double portion in their land. Everlasting joy will be theirs. For I, the Lord, for all that, love justice. I hate robbery and the burnt offering, and I will faithfully give them their reward and make an everlasting covenant with them. And we see in Hebrews, it actually called that, right? So Hebrews 13:20, now may the God of peace, who brought up from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep through the blood of the eternal covenant, that is Jesus our Lord. So the New Testament does actually call it this eternal or everlasting covenant. And we saw that connection with all of these things that are promises contained within that new covenant that we see are being fulfilled in the new covenant period. So to wrap up, Isaiah is critical to the New Testament and to the understanding of the New Testament. It's critical to the gospel. because it proclaims the gospel, and the gospel writers are using Isaiah frequently as a basis for their arguments about the gospel. It announces the new covenant. That's, where it begins. And then there's a ton of stuff in Isaiah that we can see is about the new covenant. And so every Christian should be familiar with Isaiah, not just little snippets and pieces and stuff like that, which what happens, we're reading in the New Testament and we read this quote of Isaiah and that becomes a snippet of Isaiah. But Isaiah, again, it's a mosaic. The book is to be understood in its unity, in its wholeness, that this message that it wants all the people of God to hear and to know. So it behooves us to become intimately familiar with the book of Isaiah. All right, so I'll stop there and I'll open it up for Q&A.
Well, John, ever since you announced that you're going to do this, I've been pretty excited about it. I was telling some of the folks while you was offline that I've always been afraid of Isaiah because I couldn't never make any sense out of it. But I knew I read all the New Testament quotes, and I'd go back and I'd read the context and I'd go, I have no idea what they're talking about. So this is fantastic. Thank you.
I'm excited too, Dan. Ever since I realized that the book of Isaiah is telling the gospel, I've thought, man, this should be Christianity 101. Everybody should become familiar with this book. Yeah, Greg.
Oh, I just wanted to say, hey, that was really great. A really good introduction. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. And what was that thing called with that little poetic structure you were talking about, the A, B, C, B, A?
That's a palistrophe.
Yeah, that was it. That was really interesting.
So it's similar to a chiasm or chiasm, however you want to pronounce it. But in that you would get A, B, C, C, D, A, right? You don't have this central piece that is the focal point, where you have A, B, C, B, A. So palistrophe is a little different.
Yeah.
And there's others. There's other forms like that throughout the Old Testament, not just those two. I think it's a pretty interesting study, an enlightening study, to study the writing forms that were in use in the ancient world that appear in the Bible and understand how they function. So it's sort of like understanding chapter headings and punctuation and stuff like that. It makes sense of things when you know how a comma works and stuff like that. It's a little like that.
There's a lot to be said about understanding the culture you're reading from.
Yeah, definitely.
John, do we know what occupation Isaiah was? Is that mentioned in the book? If he was a shepherd or a scribe?
There's some speculation that he was a scribe in Uzziah's court when he got commissioned by the Lord to be a prophet. But I haven't seen anything too detailed about that sort of thing. But Stephen Phillips.
Exciting, John, to see how the gospel really is being preached there. I see why you said it's the first gospel. And also, when you said the way you summed everything up, when you said that the everlasting covenant is actually the new covenant, I never saw that before. That's just, crazy me, but I just had never connected. I knew it was I just didn't connect it with being the same as the new covenant.
Yeah, you think of the new covenant as being called the new covenant, and that's predominantly what it's called in the New Testament, but that's not what it's predominantly called in the Old Testament. And but the way it's called in the Old Testament, a couple of different ways, it's other ways that it's called in the Old Testament, does appear in the New Testament, as we saw in Hebrews. But even more importantly, when you're reading about the everlasting covenant, you realize, oh, this is the new covenant, because that's what it's talking about. Greg.
Yeah, along that lines, I mean, I just had this thought, like that expression, the everlasting covenant, because a lot of people came from a dispensational view where and then a new line of thinking is, well, God deals with his people not through dispensations but through covenants. And so God may have had a certain covenant with Adam, and God had a covenant with Noah, and then God had a covenant with the nation of Israel. But the interesting thing, what I like about that expression, is it's the everlasting covenant. So not only is it a new covenant, because we've had new covenants in the past, but this one is an everlasting covenant, one that is going to fulfill like the needs of God and mankind forever. So that's
And the book of Hebrews makes a strong argument for that case, that our covenant is everlasting, because the mediator of the covenant is faithful and lives forever, right? So the Jews had Moses live forever and had been 100% faithful always, then that covenant would have stood, right? But obviously that's not how that worked. Whereas Jesus, because he's the mediator of the covenant and raised from the dead, lives forever, the covenant will always stand. And you can be a part of that covenant. This is, I think, a powerful argument for continuance in faith, that you have to remain part of him and not be cut off from him by unfaithfulness, because he's the key to that covenant, that his faithfulness is why that covenant stands, and it isn't broken. I can break my faithfulness to the covenant, but the covenant itself can't and won't be broken. Edgardo.
Yeah, thank you, John. There are a lot of scholars today who challenge the claim that Isaiah wrote the entire book that bears its name. But I'm so blessed when you have delineated reasons for Isaiah as the author. Like, for instance, the New Testament evidence. It's very strong, and it helped us to really accept the fact that Isaiah is the only author of the book of Isaiah, and also the other facts that you've mentioned, like Jesus and Isaiah, and then the gospel unfolds Isaiah said it would. And those are things that will really help the Bible student to conclude that Isaiah indeed is the only author of the book of Isaiah. Like, for instance, myself, it gives my mind clarity, and no longer thinking of other author that will only give confusion to my mind, because there are evidences you have delineated in this presentation that you have here, like, for instance, those evidences in the New Testament that really helped me to, that really convinced and persuaded me to believe that there's only one author of the book of Isaiah. And so thankful for this introduction. It helps me a lot. Thank you, John.
Amen, Eduardo.
Thank you, Edgardo. Inti.
So a quick question. I don't know if there's a quick answer for it, but my question is it during this time period of when Isaiah lived and wrote this, like within the time frame of his writing, is it in the book of Isaiah during that time period that the old covenant was done away with because Israel abandoned the covenant? And if God had done away with the covenant, then it is Isaiah encouraging them to in preparation, in preparation, you know how John the Baptist was preparing people. He wasn't telling them to do old covenant things when he said, if you have two shirts, give one, but he was preparing them for the new covenant. Is that the mentality we should have with Isaiah?
Well, there's sort of several different things I would say about your question, because there's different components to your question. That the constituent parts of Isaiah that weren't necessarily written at the same time and for the same purposes. So when he's writing, when you see the narratives, for example, and there's prophecies being made to Ahaz about the what's going to happen with Israel and Syria and that sort of thing, that individual piece, that component of the mosaic, that it has relevance to try to bring the people back to faithfulness. And so I wouldn't say necessarily that in the constituent parts you have this idea, at least in some of the constituent parts, you have this idea of preparation for the new covenant and a doing away with the old covenant. I would say there are parts like that, especially in the latter part of the book. But I would say that the mosaic itself, which brings all of the former and later writings together into this picture, absolutely is doing that. That it is preparing them for what's to come as a nation and what they need to remember and to do as the people of God in terms of being faithful and be the remnant, right? You want to be the remnant, or you want to be this unfaithful that's going to get burned up, and that the idea in, again, the later and in the overarching theme of the book is the idea God is going to redo things, and he's going to do it around this new covenant and this Messiah. So that's why it's a complicated answer to your question. It's a yes overall, and in some parts. In other parts, I don't think that individual part is designed for that, except as a part of the mosaic.
Thanks.
Well, I'm gonna close out the recording at this point. If you're listening to this or watching this later, again, we'd love to have you join us. We appreciate your support as well. If you'd like to support Allegiance to the King and Christian Virtual Fellowship, you can visit our website, and there's a donation link there. You can, if you would like to specify your donation to a particular A2K cause, such as the work in the Philippines, then you can put a comment in, and we'll make sure that those funds go to the right place. And we appreciate that you're watching, and we love you, and we really like you to be a part of what we're doing, especially if you are isolated and don't have a church family. Come be a part of ours.